Number 10. Apophis. He was the god and demon of darkness, destruction, chaos, and evil. It's said that he caused unexplainable darkness like solar eclipses, storms, earthquakes, and was often depicted as a huge serpent with tightly compressed coils. Apophis was perhaps the only Egyptian god to be all-powerful, with an army of demons at his disposal. The evil god was not worshipped, he was feared. It is also believed that no matter how many times he was challenged, he could never be entirely vanquished. In Egyptian mythology, Apophis was also the arch-enemy of the great sun god, Re. Each time Re sailed on his barge into the underworld, Apophis would attack him to prevent a sunrise. His attack method was a magical gaze that hypnotized Re and his entourage, attempting to devour them as they choked on his serpent coils. He's also known as the Eater of Souls, as he fed on both the living and the dead. This prompted the need for spells to be buried with the deceased, which would protect them against Apophis and his demons. So yeah, he just did bad things on purpose for no reason. Sounds like a great guy. Number 9. Seth. Seth is the ancient Egyptian god of war, chaos, and storm. He was initially a benevolent god and was one of the 5 deities established after the creation of the world. However, he grew resentful of his brother, Osiris, who was the ruler of the newly created Egypt. The last straw was when his wife was attracted to Osiris and committed infidelity. As a result, Seth brutally murdered his brother and was proclaimed as the first murderer. He hacked Osiris's body into pieces and dispersed it so he could not be resurrected. He subsequently took the throne of Egypt, and his reign was filled with chaos, storms, and droughts. Not to victim blame here, but I feel like this is a reasonable reaction to your wife cheating on you with your brother. Number 8. Ammit. Ammit, known as Devourer of the Dead, is sometimes classified among the ancient Egyptian gods, but she is more accurately assigned the role of a demon or a sinister goddess of the underworld. She was the forequarters of a lion, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, and had the head of a crocodile, which were the 3 largest man-eating animals known to ancient Egyptians. She's a patron of death and execution. Ammit devoured the Ba, the physical manifestation of the soul that could wander but also was required to climb the ladder to heaven and retain immortality. The other part of the soul was the Ka, the life force of the soul. When combined, they produced the divine spark of life. The idea of having one's Ba devoured by a monster, leaving them a fragment of a soul, horrified many Egyptians. Ammit lived near the scales of justice in Duat, the Egyptian underworld. In the Hall of Two Truths, the heart of a person was weighed against a feather. If the heart was judged to be impure, weighing more than the feather, Ammit would devour it, and the person undergoing judgment was not allowed to continue their voyage towards immortality. Once Ammit swallowed the heart, the soul was believed to become restless forever. This was called to die a second time. Ammit was also sometimes said to stand by a lake of fire. In some traditions, the unworthy hearts were cast into the fiery lake to be destroyed. Number 7. Khonsu. Khonsu was a god of the moon and time. It was thought that Khonsu could influence the fertility of both the people and their livestock, and one myth gives him a prominent role in the creation of the universe. He was also revered as a god of healing, but Khonsu also had a darker side. During the early part of Egyptian history, he seems to have been considered a violent and dangerous god. He appears in the human eater hymn as a bloodthirsty deity who helps the deceased king to catch and eat other gods, and the coffin text described him as Khonsu who lives on the hearts. Yet by the New Kingdom he was worshipped primarily as gentle and compassionate, so who really knows. Number 6. Hel. Hel was from Norse mythology, originally the name of the world of the dead. It later came to mean the goddess of death. Hel was one of the children of the trickster god Loki, and her kingdom was said to lie downward and northward. It was called Niflheim, or the world of darkness, and appears to have been divided into several sections, one which was the shore of corpses. There stood a castle facing north. It was filled with the venom of serpents, in which murderers, adulterers, and purgers suffered torment, while the dragon Nidhogg sucked the blood from their bodies. So yeah, her kingdom was filled with horrible people who were tortured, and I feel like that isn't even that bad. Number 5. Hades. Hades was the ruler of the underworld, or Tartarus as it was called. Being a dark and gloomy job, he was keen to cheer things up a little, and to do this he had his eye on Persephone, the daughter of the god Demeter. So what did he do? Hades came along in a chariot, swooped Persephone up, and took her down to the underworld. As if kidnapping and forcing someone to be your wife isn't bad enough, he neglected to care for her. When in Persephone's absence, Demeter was stricken with grief and nature itself began to die. Spending her time searching for her daughter, the goddess of harvest wasn't doing her job. All the crops died, nothing would grow, and the leaves fell from the trees. Needing to intervene, the gods joined the search and discovered Persephone in the underworld and demanded Hades let her go. But Hades, determined to not lose his queen completely, tricked her into eating some pomegranate seeds, as those who ate from the depths of hell must always return. So Persephone went back to Earth for 6 months every year. Demeter, being delighted at the return of her own daughter, was able to return to work, crops began to grow, flowers bloomed, and the leaves returned to the trees, giving, of course, the seasons. He kidnapped someone, which led to nature dying. Sounds like a nice guy. Number 4. Lilith. Lilith is a female demon of Jewish folklore. There are many fables surrounding this god. Some texts claim that Lilith was the first wife of the Bible's Adam and was created on par with him. However, Adam disliked her lack of subservience, so she abandoned him. Then God made an obedient wife, Eve. Consumed by jealousy, Lilith turned into a snake and tempted Eve with the forbidden apple. After the couple was banished from the Garden of Eden, Lilith transformed into a demoness, vowing her revenge on all men. Due to her bitterness and subsequent inability to bear children, Lilith was also known to threaten women in childbirth. She could only be thwarted by an amulet inscribed with the names of 3 angels, which was placed around a newborn baby's neck. Those angels were those supposedly sent by God after Lilith refused to submit to Adam. In her rage, she had flown to the Red Sea, a place full of lascivious demons. There, she bore a demonic brood of more than 100 a day. The angels threatened to drown her in the sea, but she bargained with them, consenting to allow some of her demonic children to die day after day. This agreement is why the angels' names were engraved on the amulets. When Lilith sees their names, she remembers her oath and leaves the children alone. I'm sorry, but hurting newborn children who haven't done anything, that's not nice. Those poor babies. Number 3. Poseidon. Poseidon was one of the 12 Olympians in ancient Greek religion and myth, god of the sea, storms, earthquakes, and horses. He was known for his fast-changing temperament and being easily offended. And because he was also dignified and competitive, it was very important not to offend him or argue his statements and acts, which is honestly relatable. Those who angered him became the victims of his wrath. He was known for causing major catastrophic events such as floods, earthquakes, and sea storms, and even unleashed his sea monsters in order to get even. Poseidon was also very lustful and selfish when it came to women. He had numerous affairs with both goddesses and mortals, by either seducing them or tricking them by changing his form. One of these women actually was Medusa. Now, number 2. Athena. Athena is known as the patron saint of Athens, and it's how the city got its name. While she's known as being the wisest of the gods and a level-headed strategist, like the others, she had a dark side. You've most likely heard of Medusa, the snake-headed monster whose gaze turns people into stone. What you might not know is that Medusa wasn't always like this. She was in fact a beautiful mortal. A mortal who unfortunately attracted the attention of Poseidon, who violated her in Athena's temple. When Athena found out her temple had been defiled in such a way, her rage was not directed at Poseidon, but upon poor Medusa. Like, that makes any sense. She punished Medusa with a head of serpentine locks and looks that could kill. Literally. Another instance where Athena showed her dark side involves the myth of Arachne, a beautiful and talented weaver. Arachne made the mistake of boasting these talents, saying she was the best in the world. When Athena heard about this, she challenged her to a competition. But what Arachne weaved was a depiction that mocked the gods. For her indiscretion, Athena punished her by turning her into a spider. I think Athena is just really insecure, but she didn't have to do all those things. And Coming in at number 1 is Lamashtu. The Mesopotamian goddess demoness Lamashtu is the most terrible of all female demons. Fittingly, her name means she who erases. Lamashtu enacted various other evil deeds. She disturbed sleep and brought nightmares. She killed foliage and infested rivers and streams. She bound the muscles of men and brought disease and sickness. Amulets depicting the lion-headed bird-clawed Lamashtu were worn by an expectant mother to defend herself against the demoness. Despite her dark supremacy, Lamashtu had a weakness, the plague bringer Pazuzu. He was summoned by women to protect them from the true evil Lamashtu. It's unknown whether Pazuzu did this because he felt sympathy for the expectant mothers or he simply hated the demoness.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the Teapot Dome scandal. Ah yes, what's a list of cover-ups without a good old story of bribery? Albert Fall was the Secretary of the Interior to former President Warren G. Harding, and while in this position, he decided to secretly allow oil companies to tap into the Teapot Dome oil reserve in Wyoming and the Elk Hills oil reserve in California. Of course, the reason he did it is because he could make a ton of extra money doing this, like several $100,000. This all started to unravel though in 1922 when there was an expose that revealed the oil had been sold without any sort of competitive bidding. After this expose, Robert La Follette, who is a senator in Wisconsin, created an investigation into this story by the Senate Committee on Public Lands. The Attorney General at the time, Harry Dowdy, began to get some flack for not investigating this alleged corruption, so Harry turned to the FBI director to help him out. The FBI director, William J. Burns, sent an agent to Robert, the senator from Wisconsin's, office to search for anything that could have been used to blackmail him into stopping the investigation into the corruption. Despite this seemingly obvious threat, Robert knew this meant that his investigation was going to reveal something serious, which motivated him to continue on with it. In the end, the shady dealings and bribery was revealed and Albert Fall was officially exposed. This entire ordeal led to him being the first United States Cabinet Secretary to go to prison. In our number 9 spot today we have the Dreyfus Affair. In 1984, France's government and their army were in some hot water for a series of scandals that had recently happened when a janitor discovered papers that revealed just another scandal to add to the list. This janitor had found papers in a garbage bin of a German military ambassador that revealed that there was a French officer who had turned against them and who was spying on the Germans. When this came to light, they needed a way out of the mess, so they decided to use a scapegoat, a man named Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred was a Jewish officer in the French army and they decided to accuse him of this spying and the selling of secrets. His trial was huge in the media and he ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, and really hateful and prejudiced groups used his as an example of a quote-unquote unpatriotic Jewish person. Later, the chief of military intelligence would uncover evidence that proved who the real spying culprit was, but when this happened, the chief of military intelligence was removed from his position by his superiors to try and keep the secret from getting out. It is said that French authorities tried to suppress these accusations, but a novelist named Émile Zola continued to accuse the army of a cover-up. People were torn at this point. Some people swear that Alfred was still to blame, while others were convinced he was innocent. In the end, the fight became more about principle rather than whether or not Alfred was really innocent or not. There were 12 years of controversy surrounding this case until Major Hubert Joseph Henry ended up admitting to forging the key documents before taking his own life. The case was finally reopened, and while Alfred was found guilty again, he soon received a pardon from the president. A few years after this, a civilian court of appeals found Alfred innocent, and he went on to have quite an army career, and he even fought with honor in the First World War. This was a scandal that really did change French politics forever. In our number 8 spot today we have the Ford Pinto. Introduced in 1971, the Ford Pinto would go on to become the car with the worst safety reputation, but of course not without an attempt to cover up all of the flaws first. During the car's development, during the final stages, there was crash testing being conducted, and this is when designers found out a flaw with the car. Basically, through their tests, they found that the fuel tank's filler neck had a tendency to be torn away, which would then spill gasoline under the car, as well as the fact that the tank itself was able to be easily punctured by nearby bolts. To fix this issue, it would have cost about $11 per car, but instead of spending that money, they decided to just do nothing. Yeah, they just said F it and figured that it would cost less to pay off the people who bought the car and had the issues that caused their car to catch fire. Sounds absolutely insane, and thankfully, an investigative reporter by the name of Mark Dowie thought so too. He went through a ton of paperwork that lay in the US Department of Transportation's file cabinets, and this is when he found what he was looking for: a memo where the company calculated that settling the lawsuits brought against them would save the company $70 million, rather than just installing the new parts and fixing the issue for everybody's safety and well-being. Mark wrote an expose on the story, and once published, a jury in Orange County, California awarded $125 million in damages to a man who'd been injured in a Pinto that caught fire. The ruling was later reduced to just $3 million, but it did kickstart the end of the car and the beginning of the scrutiny that the company would face. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Prohibition poisoning. You probably already know about the Prohibition era, but if not, this was a time period where there were restrictions placed on the consumption of alcohol, which was done with a ban being placed on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol by the US government, and this lasted from 1920 to 1933. In knowing about the Prohibition comes the knowledge that this ban certainly did not stop people from producing or consuming alcohol, it was just done in sneakier ways. The black market for alcohol was booming as people began to drink redistilled industrial alcohol instead. This is all pretty well known, but one super sketchy thing that is definitely less well known is something that government agencies did to curb the black market sales of alcohol. Basically, they poisoned the industrial alcohol that was being repurposed for drinking, and not just poisoned in a way where the drinker would get sick, which is already horrendous enough, but they poisoned the alcohol with lethal chemicals. It is thought that by the time the Prohibition ended, at least 10,000 people died from this. This event is still one of the strangest and deadliest decisions made by government officials. In our number 6 spot today, we have the health risk denial. In this day and age, everyone knows that smoking cigarettes isn't great for your health, but back in the day, people didn't know, and the tobacco industry did everything they could to make sure that they never found out. In 1950, a physician and epidemiologist, Dr. Ernest Winder, published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association that pointed out the links between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. This is something that is well known and studied now, but at the time, this was news to much of the public, and to hide it, 6 major cigarette companies began to fund their own research efforts in response to the study. The study wasn't aimed at actually getting to the bottom of the health risks, it was just a research project meant for publicity reasons. In reality, they already knew about the health hazards and that there was a possible link to cancer. In a 1953 survey of scientific literature, a man named Cloud Teague, who was a chemist for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, concluded that, quote, studies of clinical data tend to confirm a link between the heavy use of cigarettes and lung cancer. A scientist for a major tobacco company at the time knew and had studied the links, and they were still trying to cloud the public perception of this huge issue. The entire strategy was later revealed in a 1972 industry memo, which described it as, quote, creating doubt about the health charge without actually denying it. Finally, this madness was brought to an end, sort of, when the attorney generals from 46 states joined together in one massive lawsuit against the tobacco industry. As a result of this, while they can continue to make their harmful product, in 1998 the companies agreed to pay $10 billion annually to make up for the damage that they had done. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Chernobyl disaster. In April of 1986, crew members of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine were running a test to see how long a reactor's turbines would continue to supply power in the event of an electrical power outage. This test, however, went famously wrong due to a malfunction caused by a power surge. This caused overheating of the water inside of the reactor, which released a buildup of steam and thus explosions. These explosions caused radioactive debris and gas to be released into the atmosphere for the following 10 days. The story of Chernobyl is famous now, as it is one of the largest nuclear disasters in history. There were immediate deaths and more that followed shortly after, but there also has been a countless number of effects seen throughout the years it's been, and the area still remains dangerous due to the contamination. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, however, Soviet officials, because at the time Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, they didn't publicly admit admit that the accident had happened at all. For 2 days, they kept totally quiet about this extremely dangerous thing, and it only came out when Swedish officials rang the alarm bells as they had found increased levels of radiation that had drifted 1,000 kilometers westwards over to them. You think at this point they would have just fessed up, but of course not. The Soviet leader at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, waited 3 weeks before even publicly mentioning the accident. Who knows what level of effect this might have had in a multitude of ways. In our number 4 spot today, we have the safety cover-up. Karen Silkwood was an American chemical technician and a labor union activist who was very vocal and often raised concerns about the corporate practices that related to the health and safety of those working in a nuclear facility. You would think that this is something that all of those working in the field would be concerned about, but apparently not. She worked a job making plutonium pellets and was the first woman on the union's negotiating team, and after she testified to the Atomic Energy Commission about the things she was concerned about, it was discovered that she had plutonium contamination on both herself and in her home. Plutonium isn't an issue outside of the body but can easily be ingested or inhaled, which is when it creates a major problem for humans. Karen was driving to meet with a New York Times journalist and an official of her union's national office after deciding to go public with some of her findings, and the people who saw her right before she left for this meeting saw her with a binder full of documentations of her findings. During her trip in her car there, Karen ended up driving off of the road and striking a culvert, and this accident took her life. Here's where things get really suspicious though. That binder I just mentioned was never found. It was said that Karen had fallen asleep at the wheel and that almost twice the recommended dosage of methaqualone was found in her system. But there were clear skid marks on the road which suggested Karen was trying to get the car back straight on the road, and despite the accident being entirely at the front of the car, there was damage to the back of the car that friends and family say wasn't there before, and paint chips were found which would suggest a car had hit her from behind. To make this whole thing even more suspicious, apparently Karen was receiving death threats before her passing. There have of course been claims of foul play and claims that she was run off the road by another vehicle, but unfortunately with little to no evidence these claims have never been able to be proven for sure. But what is for sure is that whatever really happened to Karen, it seems like a simple accident doesn't cover the full truth. In the end, however, because of everything that went on with Karen, the Department of Energy opened an investigation and ultimately shut down the facility. In the end, although it is so horrible that Karen lost hers, she definitely saved countless others' lives. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Pentagon Papers. In June of 1971, the New York Times published a few different excerpts that were taken from a top secret Department of Defense report that pertained to the United States and their involvement in the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967. These papers were created as a part of a study by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and the reason they were so important and secret is because they revealed that 4 consecutive presidential administrations had lied to and misled both Congress as well as the American people about their involvement in the war. Daniel Ellsberg, who is said to have been a military analyst who opposed the war, leaked these confidential government records, and him, as well as the New York Times and the Washington Post, all faced criminal charges in court for their efforts to get the papers into public knowledge, but in a turn of events the charges were later dismissed. Not only were these papers important, but the leak was a crucial moment in time because it bred major distrust in the United States government that would only go on to grow. In our number 2 spot today, we have Operation Paperclip. I suppose this is less of a cover-up and more of just a secret operation, but this one was kept a secret not for the safety of the people, but instead to prevent an uproar from the public. This operation began in 1946 when the President of the United States at the time, Harry Truman, authorized it. Basically, the entire point of it was to lure scientists from Germany over to the United States after the Second World War. This was done in an effort to aid the country in their post-war efforts, as well as to ensure that the valuable knowledge these people had would not end up in the hands of perhaps the Soviet Union or either side of the divided East and West Germany. Had it not been classified information at the time, this would have been highly controversial, as many of these people were involved in, and sometimes even leaders of that hateful party we won't mention by name again. Former President Truman stood by his decision, saying that because of the relations with the Soviet Union, quote, "this had to be done and was done." Several of the scientists a part of this program were later investigated because of their former ties, but one was only ever tried out of the over 1,600. None of the paperclip scientists were ever found guilty for any crimes either in the United States or in Germany. Perhaps the most famous of all of the paperclip scientists was Wernher von Braun, who really played a huge role in advancing NASA's Apollo missions. In our number 1 spot today, we have up the Watergate scandal. It's perhaps one of the largest scandals and leaks in history, especially in the history of the United States. In the middle of 1972, there were 5 men who were arrested for breaking into and subsequently trying to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. As the year went on, the 1972 presidential election came closer, and there was an anonymous source who fed information to Washington Post reporters that, quote, the Watergate bugging incident stemmed from a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of President Nixon's re-election and directed by officials of the White House. Despite this information leak and it being reported on the news, Nixon was still re-elected, but he was also under serious investigation. There was a series of Senate hearings, and the Senate even went on to create a special investigative committee. The hearings were broadcast nationwide, and they had witnesses testifying that Nixon had approved plans to cover up administration involvement in the break-in, and that there was a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office. These hearings captured the attention of Americans everywhere for weeks, and in the end, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to release these Oval Office tapes to government investigators, which then went on to reveal that he had not only attempted to cover up what went on, but he also later tried to use federal officials to deflect the investigation. Under the threat of an imminent impeachment, Nixon had no choice but to admit his guilt and resign, making him the only president to do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, ended up pardoning him, so he escaped prosecution, but there were 69 other people indicted, with 48 of them later being convicted.
Number 10. The 1904 Olympic Marathon. The 1904 Olympic Marathon probably had some of the most interesting competitors ever. It wasn't just one person who made this race bizarre, but a whole handful of people and strange circumstances. First off, the course was just absolutely covered in dust, and breathing it in caused a bunch of the runners to suffer severe internal injuries. So right off the bat, the race just totally sucked. The man who finished the race in first place got some bad cramps and decided he was just gonna hitch a ride in a car. Then he got out near the finish line and ran across. The guy who came in second place was given a mixture of different foods and chemicals, which were actually a poison used to kill rodents, but they were trying to use it as like a steroid to make him a better runner, and instead his crew ended up carrying him across the finish line. The guy who came fourth gambled all his money when he got to the United States and ended up having to wear full dress clothing to the race, using a knife to cut his pants into shorts. He then ate some apples during the race, got sick, and took a nap, but still came fourth. Number 9. Robert Liston surgery. We all know that medical practices throughout history were a bit dodgy, and they didn't have a lot of the comforts that we have today. A man named Robert Liston was known as one of the fastest surgeons in the 1800s, and you had to be fast because they didn't have anesthesia, so surgery basically sucked for everybody involved. Liston also became the only person to perform a surgery with a 300% mortality rate. He was performing a leg amputation surgery, but worked so fast he accidentally cut off 2 of his assistant's fingers. Both the patient and the assistant died of infection because the saw he used was dirty. The third death occurred when, during the procedure, Liston accidentally sliced a nearby doctor's coat. But just the coat. The doctor thought he had been cut open, went into shock, and died of a heart attack, leading to 3 people dying during an operation meant to just save 1 person. Number 8. Salem tomato trial. We're all well aware of the Salem witch trials, but you've probably never heard of the Salem tomato trials. In the early 1800s, tomatoes were put on trial in Salem, New Jersey because they were believed to be poisonous. The tomato was also considered a sinful fruit because it can act as a mild aphrodisiac. Only one man in the town defended tomatoes during the trial and even tried to bring about tomato growing competitions so people would be less afraid. He would also regularly eat them in front of everybody, leading most people to think he was completely insane. Growing annoyed with the trial and fear of tomatoes, he decided to walk in front of the courthouse with an entire basket of tomatoes in his hands. He then proceeded to eat the entire pile of tomatoes as a crowd gathered around and watched, and to their shock, the man did not immediately die. This was enough to finally convince people that tomatoes were not evil. Number 7. Wojtek. During the Second World War, the Polish army recruited one of the most unique soldiers ever, a bear named Wojtek, and based on the soldier's accounts, he was actually pretty damn cool. The Polish soldiers found the bear cub by the side of a road, his mother apparently having been killed by hunters. So the soldiers took him in and raised him, and a civilian refugee even helped to train the animal. In order to get him on a British transport ship, he was officially enlisted as a Polish soldier, being given a paybook, serial number, and the rank of private. He would apparently sleep in the bunks with the other soldiers and was also a huge fan of beer and cigarettes. He also would do actual work for the army, helping to transport supplies and carry heavy boxes of ammunition. After the war, he was relocated to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived out the rest of his days, passing away at the age of 21. The average lifespan of a bear is 20 to 30 years, so that's really not bad for a guy raised on beer and cigarettes. Number 6. Nuclear war. Did you know that we were probably a lot closer to nuclear war than we thought? Back during the Cold War in the 80s, everyone was preparing for oncoming nuclear conflict, building bunkers and hiding resources in the case of having to regrow a barren landscape. This didn't happen, and it was later revealed that we were saved from this outcome by a single man. In 1983, a freak accident where sunlight reflected off high altitude clouds caused a Soviet satellite system to indicate that there were 5 incoming missiles, which they of course assumed to be coming from the American military. A lieutenant colonel by the name of Stanislav reasoned that if the United States were actually starting a nuclear war, it would be a full attack and not just 5 missiles. So he called it a false alarm and, against his orders, refused to initiate their own nuclear launch out of retaliation. Number 5. New Atlantis. In 1964, Ernest Hemingway's younger brother named Lester sailed out to international waters near Jamaica and started his own country. Yeah, he sailed a barge made out of bamboo that was about 8 by 30 feet and declared it a micronation that was half independent and half part of the United States. So how did he manage to do that? He discovered an obscure law called the Guano Islands Act of 1856, which says that US citizens can claim ownership of unclaimed islands that had guano deposits, which, if you're not aware, is bird and bat. He claimed his new nation to be called New Atlantis and even wrote a new constitution for it, though this constitution was actually just the United States Constitution, with every mention of the United States being changed to New Atlantis. The plan was to use this as a publicity stunt to raise money and use the raft as a research facility. Unfortunately, New Atlantis was wrecked by a tropical storm just 2 years after it was constructed. Number 4. The War on Cats. Pope Gregory IX lived from 1145 to 1241 and became the Pope when he was already over 80 years old. He had a history as a lawyer and was known for putting a few different motions through during his time as head of the church. Unfortunately for cat lovers, Gregory was a bit of a red flag because he was apparently more of a dog person. He put forward the first ever church documents that condemned black cats as being instruments of Satan, effectively starting the war on cats and placing a target on the head of every black cat in the area. Shortly after Gregory's time, the Black Death came about thanks to diseased rats spreading the infection all over the place and leading to a lot of people living during that era having a pretty bad time. Some people blame the Black Death on Gregory's war on cats because they say, due to the reduced cat population, the rat population inflated, so they were just running around willy-nilly spreading disease. Number 3. The Siege of Weinsberg. Weinsberg is a town near the southwest part of Germany. The name of the castle that sits above the town roughly translates to Women's Faithfulness Castle. So why is that? In the year 1140, King Conrad III defeated the Duke of Welf and placed the town of Weinsberg under siege. The women negotiated a surrender that held the terms that they would be allowed to leave the town unharmed with whatever they could carry on their shoulders. Conrad probably thought that they were just gonna take their children, clothes, food, maybe a goat. What he didn't expect was for all the women of the town to take their husbands and other men upon their shoulders and carry them out of town. The king's people were like, yo dude, they can't do that, but the king was like, nah, that's actually kind of valid and let it happen, saying a king should always stand by his word. Number 2. Astronomer's pet moose. A 16th century astronomer who discovered the supernova was known not only for that, but also for just being a bit of a bizarre guy. A few of his odd behaviors included losing his nose in a duel, keeping a jester/clairvoyant in his house, and having a pet moose. The pet moose was apparently just as bizarre as he was. The moose apparently lived in the castle with him and would walk alongside him like a loyal dog, and apparently also had an unquenchable thirst for Danish beer. Him and his pet became extremely popular, and they would often be invited to dinner parties together to show off the moose's tame behavior. Unfortunately, the moose's alcoholism got out of control at one of these dinner parties, and he had a bit too much to drink. He chugged beers with noblemen until he managed to stumble up a set of stairs in the castle before falling off and passing away. Number 1. The latrine disaster of 1184. German noblemen during the Roman Empire would often meet to have discussions over land disputes and try to find some temporary peace. King Henry VI called for a meeting over a dispute which would take place in the Church of St. Peter in Erfurt. They all gathered in a room that was directly above the building's toilet pit. The weight of all the people on the floor, add to that their heavy chain clothing, caused the floor to collapse and they all fell into the pit below. Between 60 and 100 of the people gathered there ended up passing away in the human waste, whether it be from drowning or being crushed by the floor. One of the deaths was Count Heinrich of Schwarzburg, who had previously joked he would perish in his own shit if he ever failed his title.
Coming up at our number 10 spot, we have Julia Brown. Now, Julia Brown is from a small town in Louisiana, and she was known to be a pretty terrifying witch in her time. She became known as a witch because she would perform spells and had charms, and yes, she would place curses on people. Yeah, this is a real person, folks. Apparently, she would perform rituals for people in the town and do spells for them, and eventually they began to take advantage of her, and that is when things took a turn. She started to tell people that bad things were going to happen to them. She would make predictions for them, such as tell them their death dates, and that really creeped a lot of people out. She loved to sing, and at some point she created a song about how she was going to get revenge on the town when she died. "When I die, I'm taking the town with me," she sang. Well, as you might have already guessed, when she died, she certainly got revenge on the town. As her casket was being lowered, rain fell on the town, and that rain eventually turned into a hurricane that wiped out the town. Yep, she might be scarier than a demon. It's possible. In our number 9 spot, we have Moll Dyer. It is unclear if Moll Dyer was a real person or if she was just a legend. People say that she was real, however, there have been no documents to prove this to date, so for the purpose of this video, we are going to say she was probably real. And by real, I mean a real witch, a real scary witch. Moll lived in Maryland in the 17th century. She apparently had tormentors when she was alive and put a curse on them before she died. She died running away from them and froze to death on a rock that the town still displays today, as apparently you can still see her handprint on the rock. The ancestors of her tormentors apparently are all cursed with bad luck. Well, all I can say is I would not want to marry into one of their families. Also, how do we know that they are still cursed with bad luck if they are, born and then told that they are cursed with bad luck? Because maybe they have attracted it now because they believe that they have bad luck. I say those people need to leave the town, forget this legend, and see if the next generation has bad luck, and then we will have proof if this curse has actually continued. Moll was spoken about in the famous movie The Blair Witch Project, in which I have not seen, but probably should. In our number 8 spot, we have Kate Batts. This is probably one of the scariest witches on this list. Kate Batts was a neighbor to a man named John Bell, and apparently was a witch tormenting John and his family from her grave. Very powerful. John and his daughter Betsy were tormented in many different ways. Betsy was attacked apparently by an unknown force, and they would both hear chain sounds and always feel on edge. Eventually, the entity that was tormenting them told them that she was their former neighbor, Kate Batts, and that she was going to destroy their family. Eventually, John was found dead with a small vial of liquid beside him, believed to be poison from Kate the entity. Apparently, she stopped tormenting the family after John passed. Why she was tormenting the family family is unknown, but perhaps it was because John did something bad to her when she was alive. That's the only explanation I can think of. Perhaps his guilty conscience could have concocted the whole story. That feels possible as well. In our number 7 spot, we have Gerald Gardner. Known as the creator of Wicca, a religious version of witchcraft, Gerald Gardner is arguably scarier than a demon to some, but perhaps just an egotistical man to most. In 1954, he wrote a book called Witchcraft Today, and it became widely popular around the world, and it helped pave the way for more widespread acceptance of witchcraft. So even though that has done a lot of good for the community, he is a bit of a controversial character that may have caused harm as well. A lot of people are angry at the fact that he became known as the founder of Wicca when he himself did not actually find it. He just wrote a book about it and then got credited for it. This has angered many witches around the world, and many people are frustrated that he has claimed the title of founder when he indeed is not. Nobody likes a faker, and it does not do any good for the religion to have its leader be dishonest. Coming up in our number 6 spot, we have La Voisine. Catherine, aka La Voisine, was a witch in the 1600s in France who would do spells, mix potions, and tell fortunes to the townspeople. Apparently, she would hold black masses and she would channel the devil. She really grew to fame when she discovered that a lot of wives wanted their husbands to pass away, and so she created potions to help them do so. She gained quite a bit of fortune from these potions. After some time, she became more and more dark as she began to take the lives of innocent people as a sacrifice for the devil, and eventually she was arrested for killing many people, and she was, burned at the stake. This woman seems absolutely terrifying, and I am so glad that I live in 2022 and not the 16th century. Definitely seems more terrifying than a demon. On second thought, perhaps she was actually one. In our number 5 spot, we have Agnes Sampson. Agnes was a well-known healer in her time, which was around 1590, when the King of Scotland single-handedly started the witch trials around the world due to his paranoia over witches and his belief that a witch was the cause for a few big storms in Scotland. Talk about paranoid. Heesh. Anyways, Agnes was one of the witches that was captured during this time and tortured and thrown in jail. She was known for her healing potions that worked like magic, and so naturally she was accused of being a witch. They didn't have natural paths back then, so there's that. Anyways, turns out they were right to accuse her because while in jail, she actually confessed and said that she worshipped Satan and that she even was physically involved with him, if you catch my drift. So yeah, after this, she was sentenced to death. In our number 4 spot, we have Anne Hibbins. In the 1650s, there was a woman by the name of Anne Hibbins who was accused of being a witch. And perhaps she was, but maybe not in the typical way like the others on this list. Perhaps she was just not a great person and her personality was scarier than a demon and she perhaps got what she deserved. Apparently, Anne was a very wealthy woman, being very connected, and her brother-in-law was a future governor of Massachusetts and her husband was a civil law officer. Her husband apparently condemned a woman for being a witch. When he passed away, she was left a bit in ruin and she wasn't very well liked. She had sued a bunch of carpenters years prior that her community loved, and that made people hate her. She was then accused of being a witch and sentenced to death. There's not too many reports on her, so it's hard to say if she really was a nasty woman or not, but if she was, then all I can say is this sounds like the case of Queen Karma herself. In our number 3 spot, we have Alice Keitler. Alice Keitler was one of the first witches known in Ireland. She apparently was married 4 times and outlived all of her husbands. Yep, of course that was unusual for this period, which was the 13th century. All of her husbands died mysteriously, and after every one, people grew more and more suspicious of her, naturally. Until her final husband died, then his kids accused her of poisoning him. Eventually, rumors began to spread that she had killed her husbands as offerings to the devil himself. She also wasn't very well liked in the town, so that didn't help her case either. But apparently she had been worshipping him for decades. People began pushing for her to be captured and to have a formal trial, but before they were able to, she fled the country. Thus proving that she probably did kill her husbands. She might not have been a witch, but it's definitely possible she was. In our number 2 spot, we have Malin Matsdotter. Malin and her husband were were either evil or they were being possessed, because their story really gives me the creeps. In 1676, Mullen's husband was sentenced to death for being inappropriate with an animal. Makes me sick. And Mullen was accused of being a witch by her own daughter. Her daughter said that she would worship the devil. Apparently, many young ones went missing in her town, and people believed that she snatched them and sacrificed them. At her trial, she was accused of taking them, and since her daughter was among the accusers, she had no chance. She was sentenced to death. She died without a sound, which confirmed to many that she was a real witch because they apparently don't feel pain. Guys, maybe she was a real witch. If I get too close to the oven and feel the heat, I react. So if I was her, I would have made my exit the most dramatic show anyone would ever see. So dramatic people would laugh and wish they hadn't burned me. In our number 1 spot, we of course have Aleister Crowley. Not all witches are women, folks. Probably the worst witch that I have ever read about was a male, and he was the darkest they come. People called him the wickedest man to have ever existed. Scarier than a demon. In fact, he was probably Satan himself. Of course, I'm speaking of Aleister Crowley, who was alive not too long ago. Close to 100 years ago, he was being kicked out of Italy for his occult gatherings, where it is believed that he channeled Satan and everyone danced naked under the moon. Such fun. He would refer to himself as the Beast or the Antichrist. He traveled around the world promoting his religion called Thelma and promoted his teachings. He wrote many books, including the Book of Thoth, the Book of Lies, and the Book of the Law. The scary thing about Aleister is that people still follow his teachings today.
Starting us off at number 10, we have mummy unwrapping parties. So we already know that people love to do all kinds of weird and strange things with mummies back in the day. But after people widely stopped eating them or using their remains to make medicines, a new mummy trend began. After Napoleon's first expedition to Egypt in 1798, Europeans began to become even more enthralled with mummies than they ever had been. In the 19th century, a mummy craze began. Travelers began bringing back whole mummies they had bought off the street in Egypt. And the next thing you know, they were no longer thought of having medicinal purposes, but rather being a wonderful party activity. Soon it became customary to hold mummy unwrapping parties, and wealthy Victorians would gather around as the host slowly unwrapped the dead body, showing off his wealth while simultaneously giving guests a thrilling evening filled with horror and delight. I have no clue what was done with the mummies after the public unboxing, but somehow I almost think it's better, as I'm sure whatever happened next was even more disgusting. Number 9. Bomb shadows. We all likely know and were taught about the devastating bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 226,000 people in 1945. But one thing that you may not have learned about was what those bombs left behind. Apparently, as the attack was happening, the light and heat from the weapon was absorbed by the people and the objects in front of it. The surrounding light and heat then ended up bleaching the areas of the ground where nothing had been, leaving objects and people-shaped marks on the pavement. They became known as the shadows of the dead, and even now, after nearly 80 years, some of the shadows remain stained into the pavement and walls all over the city, as a reminder to the human capacity for destruction. Coming in at number 8, Vlad the Impaler. Born into a royal family in 1431, Vlad III was son of Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia at the time. During this time, Transylvania faced a lot of battles and bloodshed as the Ottoman Empire kept trying to push west towards Europe, and the Christian Crusaders marched eastward towards the Holy Land. In 1442, Vlad Dracul was called to a diplomatic meeting with the Ottomans and brought with him his sons. But the meeting was a trap, and all three were arrested and held hostage. The father was granted to leave as long as he left his sons behind, and he agreed. So for the next few years, Vlad and his brother were trapped and tortured, although they did also strangely tutor the men in science, philosophy, and art, as well as turn them into warriors. Eventually, his brother and father both died, and Vlad was released. Soon after, he became the leader of Wallachia, and when the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Vlad led the force to defend his land from an invasion. It was during this time he became known as Vlad the Impaler, as he often used metal metal or wooden poles to impale invaders right through their chest, or sometimes he would even insert it vertically up the victim until it pierced through their shoulders, neck, or mouth. While well respected, he became notorious for killing thousands of people and eventually became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Count Dracula. Coming in at number 7, incubators. Nowadays, incubators are seen as life-saving devices for premature newborns, but shockingly, this was not always the attitude towards them. During the early 20th century, most physicians kind of held the belief that premature infants were not meant to survive, and so they were tragically just kind of left to die in most cases. But Martin Cooney held a different belief from his peers and wanted to try and change the narrative. But in order to do so, he had to make it a spectacle. One thing that people loved to do back in the day was gawk at the unusual, laugh at the different, and it's for that very reason that sideshows existed. So in order to save the lives of the preemies, Cooney decided to display them in what he called hatcheries as a sideshow in Coney Island. For a quarter, visitors could gaze upon the peculiar and small young people, and over the years he managed to save more than 6,500 lives by packaging up their safety in a swallowable pill for the times he lived in. After so much success, doctors started coming around his ideas, and now they are used by hospitals around the world. Next up at number 6, Pharaoh Pepi. Although the exact timeline is up for debate, somewhere around 2278 BC to 2216 BC, Pharaoh Pepi II reigned in Egypt. The ruler succeeded the throne at age 6 and became widely known as being one of Egypt's most demanding kings, which comes with little to no surprise that a literal first grader being given the power of a pharaoh affected his ego in a negative way. Often he demanded outlandish tasks of his slaves and subjects, but most strange of all was his practice to keep flies off of him. Apparently he hated flies more than anything in the world, so Pepi would force several slaves a day to be covered head to toe in honey and then stand naked by him in hopes to attract the bugs towards them and off himself. By the end of their days, his slaves would be covered in bites, boils, and sores caused by the countless insects that swarmed to them, and soon they would often succumb to diseases like malaria. Later on, flies actually became more or less a creature of high esteem for the Egyptians, becoming a symbol for persistence and tenacity, but for the near 90-year or so reign under Pepi, they were apparently the worst creature alive. Coming in at number 5, a cat phone. In 1929, a pair of scientists at Princeton University had a question. They wanted to test out how the auditory nerve perceives sound. But in order to test that, they had to find a subject. Now, as you can imagine, not too many people were lining up for this, so they ultimately decided to perform the experiment on a cat. The cat was heavily sedated prior to the operation, where the scientists cut out parts of its brain before attaching one end of a telephone wire into its auditory nerve and the other end into a receiver. Shockingly, the cat survived the operation, and the scientists went forward with their experiment. To their delight, they discovered that if you spoke into the cat's ear, you could hear it perfectly through the receiver. But their initial success was not enough for them. Next, they had to know if it worked once the cat was dead. So they killed the cat to test their theory, but sadly the cat phone no longer functioned without access to a functional brain. Despite its rather gruesome story, the two did actually contribute to a valuable understanding of the brain and helped future researchers in development of cochlear implants. So at least it wasn't all in vain. Coming in at number 4, death photography. Memento mori means remember you must die. For centuries, trinkets were used to keep the thought of death close and to help the living through their grieving process. In Victorian times, this looked like lockets filled with hair of the dead, a mask of your loved one created out of wax, or by having paintings and sculptures made in their memory. But all of a sudden, a new invention came along that led to creating an all-new kind of memento mori, the photograph. As its popularity increased, the price of having your photo taken was all of a sudden cheaper than a portrait, and many began using this new technology to keep the the essence of their loved ones preserved forever. Next thing you know, families are getting photos taken with their dead family members, and for many it was even the first time getting a photo taken. The dead were sometimes propped up to look alive, while other times eyeballs were painted on after it developed to give them a more lifelike look. The pictures would be hung in the house just like any normal family portrait and served as a reminder to the family of the ones they lost. Thankfully, the practice went out of style as healthcare began to improve and less people were dying so young. Coming in at number 3, gibbeting. During medieval times, the practice of execution was really just an average Tuesday afternoon, and even darker was that it was pretty common practice for criminals to be left on the gallows after they were hanged, as sort of a warning sign to the others in the town. But another form of torturous death they made criminals endure was called gibbeting. The ancient practice consisted of humiliating and hanging a criminal from a large post, but unlike being hanged, the convict was stuffed inside a small cage that was left dangling in the air. The victim would be put in the cage completely alive and essentially left to rot, while people of the town gathered round to witness the spectacle, often even torturing the criminal in their own ways. Eventually, after starvation, cold, and muscle atrophy, they would die and their rotting bodies would be left inside the hanging cage for weeks, sometimes even years, until nothing but their skeletons remained inside. Eventually, the practice was outlawed by the mid-1800s, but some say that if you walk past an old gibbeting cage, you can still hear the screams of the soul who died inside. Coming in at number 2, chats with a severed head. In the early 1900s, a French physician named Gabriel Boudieu was interested in exploring the connection between mind, brain, and body. So in 1905, when the execution of Henri Languille was announced, he rushed to the guillotine to study the aftermath. Boudieu claimed that after the guillotine dropped and the head fell to the ground, he called out to the victim and the severed head allegedly blinked his eyes as if awakening. He wrote, "The eyelids lifted up, this time I swear, in a distinctly normal movement, slow as if awakening or torn from thought." He further detailed that the pupils focused in on him until slowly the eyelids faded closed. But once again, he called the man's name and his eyes opened. Some believe that it was simply leftover nerve impulses, but Gabriel swore that the head could hear him and understand him. He said he felt something looking into his eyes and knew it wasn't just a coincidence. And last up today, the Leningrad famine. For 872 days, the people of Leningrad suffered one of the most destructive military blockades in history. In just a little less than 3 years, the population dropped from 2.5 million to just 800,000. In September of 1941, they were bombarded by the Axis powers and cut off from the outside world, receiving no wood, no gas, no coal, and no food. And it only got worse once winter hit. Soon they were trying to stay alive with no food in -40-degree temperatures, and so many resorted to burning their possessions just to evade death one more day. But as time went on, it only got darker and darker. People would leave their homes and never return. At first, many assumed they died in the cold, but suddenly it was happening more and more frequently. It didn't take too long to draw a connection to the mysterious disappearances, as the next day there would magically be meat available at the market, usually labeled as horse or dog. Soon after, people began killing firsthand, just to feed themselves, and some were even driven to kill their own families just to survive. Officially, there are 2,000 recorded cases of eating human flesh, but it's believed to be much higher. All the while, of course, the elite hoarded food that came into the city via the lakes and never once went hungry. There are journal recordings from the same time about eating goose and caviar at a party while the commoners froze to death in the streets. Starting us off at number 10 is divorce. Well, today you can pretty much get a divorce
divorce for, well, really any reason you want, that wasn't always the case. In fact, prior to being able to file over irreconcilable differences like most couples do now, pretty much only men were allowed to divorce their wives, not the other way around. Unless, that is, the wife could prove her husband's impotence, as it was seen as a woman's legal duty to bestow a child to her husband. If he couldn't give her the goods per se, she could file for an annulment of the marriage. But how did the court go about proving this, you ask? Well, of course they couldn't just take the woman's word for it, so they would bring in a witness, usually a sex worker, to try and arouse the man. That, or the court would enter your marital bedroom and, well, see for themselves just how well the man could get the job done. If he did in fact have any issues completing his manly duties, the woman could be freed of the marriage. Just be careful they don't accuse you of becoming a witch. Next up at number 9 is man-made fertilizer. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 resulted in the death of an estimated 60,000 soldiers, but not many of these bones have ever been recovered, and the reason why is pretty grim. In a strange, twisted series of events, the English decided to clear the field of the corpses and put the bones to use in a rather effective, but albeit creepy way. Newspapers of the time reported that the fallen French army were ground up in Yorkshire factories and the bone dust was added to their manure. Apparently the oil from the marrow proved especially helpful in the grave robbing turned fertilizer plan, and the fertilizer was purchased by farmers across England and scattered widely to help grow their crops, meaning that an entire generation of England ate food made possible with the help of dead French soldiers. Coming in at number 8 is Qin Shi Huang. Before the understanding of modern science, there was a lot of ideas about elixirs and remedies that have quite literally no logic to back them up. Now, of course, it wasn't their fault. They truthfully didn't know any better. But looking back, that doesn't make it any less wild. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was one of the many intent on finding the elixir of immortality, and so he demanded his royal doctors find this magical potion for him, otherwise he would have them killed. I mean, just real low stakes stuff. Eventually, likely under the duress of not wanting to be killed and also probably not knowing what they were doing, they offered him a magic potion that they promised would bring him eternal life. The magic potion, however, was actually just mercury, and the emperor ended up dying from poisoning himself. A bit ironic that in the pursuit of eternal life, he actually only made his life shorter. Coming in at number 7 is Henry Rathbone. During school, we all learned about John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington. But did you know that that wasn't the only tragedy to occur due to that night's events? In the theater with Lincoln that night was his wife, along with Henry Rathbone, a military officer, and his girlfriend Clara. At the time of the assassination, Rathbone saw Booth and tried to save Lincoln, but Booth stabbed him before he could reach the president. Although he physically survived the attack, he left with a deep-seated guilt about not being able to save the president's life. 2 years went by, and despite trying to move on from the tragedy by marrying Clara and starting a family, his mind never fully recovered and he became more and more paranoid about the world around him. He began claiming to hear voices speak to him from behind the walls that would taunt him endlessly, until eventually they pushed him towards complete breakdown. Convinced it was the only option, Rathbone shot and killed his wife before stabbing himself in an attempt to take his own. But just like before, he survived the attack on himself. Eventually he was tried for killing his wife and sent to live the rest of his life in an asylum. Coming in at number 6 is an animal trial. So not only did they have trials over the impotence of a man, believe it or not, you could also take a literal animal to court in the Middle Ages. I kid you not. The whole kit and caboodle would be present. A judge, prosecutor, witnesses, a defense attorney. They truly took it very seriously. The reasoning behind it all, I suppose, was that at the time, law prohibited punishment without trial for everything and everyone. The first recorded instance was the prosecution of a pig in France in 1266, accused of eating a young boy. The pig was found guilty for his crime and executed as punishment. If that doesn't sound crazy enough, keep in mind the judge would hold the behavior of the accused animal against it, and if the court didn't feel the animal was acting properly, that was taken into account. These trials were only put on against domestic animals, as they truly believed, having been in the company of humans, they should know how to act. Now, not all animals were executed for their crimes. Some some lesser criminals were merely excommunicated from the church or cursed and sent to live in the wild, but it's still crazy. I mean, honestly, I wish I was making this up. Coming in at number 5 is John Scott Harrison. Raised by the 9th President of the US, William Henry, and the father of the 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison, although John Scott himself never rose to presidential ranks, he did serve 2 years in Congress and was a prominent political figure in his time. But one day he decided politics wasn't really for him anymore and spent his last 20 years managing a farm in Ohio. After his death in 1878, his family gathered for the service and took great pains to protect his grave. At the time, grave robbing was at an all-time peak due to the demand for cadavers in medical schools. To avoid having his father be another subject of this, Benjamin had an unusually deep grave made and placed a massive stone that required 16 men to move placed on top of his casket. For extra measure, he then covered the whole ordeal in cement, then placed small wooden pegs below the surface of the covering so that he could tell if it had been disturbed. Oh, and he hired a security guard to watch it day and night for the next 30 days. After noticing a nearby family friend's grave had been exhumed, Benjamin and his nephew went to go and track it down. They managed to obtain a warrant for the Medical College of Ohio and with the help of a detective went to retrieve the corpse of their dear friend. When they arrived, they found a dissecting room on the top floor, but to their surprise they couldn't find who they were looking for. Instead, they happened upon a body that looked strangely familiar, and when they removed the rags covering the head, they were horrified to discover it was the corpse of one Mr. John Scott Harrison. How the grave robber managed, we will never know. Next up at number 4 is La Custa. The Pax Romana is known for being one of the most peaceful times in history. The Romans had pretty much conquered what they set out to, and so they began to, just chill out for a bit. Then along came La Custa, esteemed maker of poisons and the world's first serial killer. Well, more like a hired assassin by the Roman Empire. Locusta was routinely caught poisoning people and despite frequent arrests for her killings, was always let free. Why is that? Well, the Empire got word and decided they could use her to their advantage. Her first big gig came from Empress Agrippina to kill her husband, Emperor Claudius. Locusta complied with glee and assassinated the emperor. However, soon after, Agrippina threw her under the bus for the crime. But now, under the ruling of Lord Nero, he saved her for his own devilish plots. For the next 15 years under Nero, she worked consistently and was even awarded for her service. Locusta received a villa and even a small staff to help her in her poisonous endeavors. Nero even went as far to provide her with her own school for the profession. But after Nero was sentenced to death, Locusta lost her security blanket and lawful immunity and was executed by the emperor for her crimes. Coming in at number 3 is Gilles de Rais. Joan of Arc is, rightfully so, credited as a certified badass and patron saint who was a major defender of the French during the 100 Years' War. Among her most supportive and trusted allies was Gilles de Rais, an esteemed knight in the French army who was appointed the highest military distinction one could receive at the time. But if he was such a big deal and close companion of Joan, why isn't he as widely celebrated? Well, that's because sadly he was actually super evil. By day he was defending France beside Joan of Arc, but at night he was into the senseless killing of minors in occultist rituals. Often he would lure the unsuspecting victims in with psychological torture, convincing them that it was just a game, before bludgeoning them and doing other cruel and unspeakable things to their corpses, supposedly using them for his rituals. Eventually he was found out and tried for his crimes, admitting to all his vicious acts and hanged as punishment. Although no one knows for sure, it's suspected he had nearly 150 victims. Coming in at number 2 is virginity tests. Back in a time when a woman was merely the property of her husband, there was one very important thing that needed to be assured before the wedding night: that she was pure. Mostly because it was believed that the consummation in fact kind of sealed the whole husband owning his wife deal, and if she had done it with anyone else, she didn't really belong to him. Charming. So to ensure that their potential wife was worth the dowry, suitors would perform virginity tests on their brides to make sure they weren't getting a second-hand woman, if you will. Such tests included inspecting their urine, as it was believed a virgin's urine would be clear, Other times they would give the woman a special potion, and if she could refrain from peeing, she was a virgin, as if a bladder was any indication of that. Sometimes a physician would be hired to inspect the woman's downstairs area, as they believed they could literally just tell by looking at it. Most common though was to inspect the sheets after the marriage was consummated. If there was blood, hooray, a virgin. If not, well then it was assumed she was a liar and her husband was legally entitled to compensation for being swindled into marrying her. And last up today are syphilis zombies. Sometimes it's easy to forget just how much antibiotics have changed the world around us. While nowadays a shot of penicillin can keep an early onset of the STI at bay, back in the day it could quite literally be the end of you. In fact, in 1494, Italy experienced one of the worst outbreaks in history, and if you didn't know any better, you might have thought it was a zombie apocalypse. Of course, before there was any kind of real understanding about how these types of diseases could be spread or caught, people were, let's just say, having a lot of fun with each other. But on the flip side of that, if they caught the infection, it would cause flesh to literally dissolve off their bodies until their inevitable death within a few months. It was also widely believed that bedding a virgin could cure you of the disease, so that's fun. Apparently, it was not uncommon to witness people missing hands, feet, eyes, noses, or look as if they'd been dropped into a vat of acid while walking down the street. Also remember that it took a few months before the disease actually killed them, so they were just living in excruciating pain while their flesh was slowly eaten away, in some cases right down to the bone. With that image in mind, it does make a little bit more sense as to why they believed you would go to hell for premarital relations. Like, I kind of get why they thought it was the devil punishing you for your sins. Thank God for antibiotics.